So this summer I was here in Baltimore researching the impact of poetry, specifically performance poetry, on creating inclusive spaces for communities. So I was going around to different poetry events in the Baltimore and DC area throughout the summer and meeting local poets and lovers of poetry, as well as doing some research into what there is out there about performance poetry already and what there isn't out there. The most difficult part, I'd say, wasn't even getting the grant, it was deciding what I wanted to research, because I'm kind of a person that's interested in way too many things for my own good. So I had a bunch of ideas for what my project could be and was talking to professors for a long time before I settled on an idea. So once I had an idea, it was a pretty easy process to work with my professor to write up an explanation of what I wanted to do and talk to Dr. Osteen and some of my other advisors about if this was something I should go ahead with. And from there, it was pretty easy. Yeah, so this summer, my advisor was Professor John Malice of the Fine Arts Department, and that was like really cool because he has a photojournalism background, and so the journalism background is a lot different from my English background. So I was able to kind of get an idea of how do you enter into a space, like being aware of like what you need to notice and what you need to pick up on, but also being fully present in that space. And then along the way, I met a ton of really cool poets from all around Baltimore and DC. Particularly, I met a woman named Flynn, and she is an older woman from Silver Spring, Maryland, and she is actually a survivor of domestic violence, and I met her at a domestic violence survivors poetry reading, and she's been so great and willing to just talk to me all the time about how writing has impacted her life, and has really kind of become just a light and is always checking in on me after we just had one conversation at a poetry reading. So she's also just been a great person and to validate the work I'm doing. I think I learned first time management, because it's a lot different to be doing research all by yourself. I'm an English major, so I'm used to writing papers and reading, but I'm not used to kind of having all of my days free and saying, okay, I'm gonna read this day and this day. So that was like a tactical life skill, but I also learned kind of how much variety there is in the performance poetry community. I had been to slams before and participated in some open mics, but I really had the opportunity to get to know all different types of events that there were. So for example, the domestic violence survivors reading, and I also went to a youth social justice poetry reading. I went to a youth-run, youth-led Baltimore reading, and I also saw the Baltimore Queens of Poetry, which are 5 internationally ranking Baltimore women who did poetry. So I kind of saw the different like cultures, and it came to life even more than I already loved it. And so that was really cool to kind of learn about, and also to learn how much there like needs to be written and talked about, because I wasn't exposed to it before, and I know other people are lacking those experiences as well. So I think the most surprising thing for me was how little research there was for me to go off of, because I picked a pretty broad topic because I wasn't really sure exactly what I wanted to focus on, and I kind of thought, well, as the summer goes on, I'll figure out what I want to narrow in. But performance poetry actually has very little been studied by English scholars, and that was the approach that I was taking it on from. So it was interesting to see that there's really only one major scholar that's talked about performance poetry, even though this has been a major movement, especially since the 80s and 90s, and is just kind of building up today. The people who have actually studied it have been majorly educators or people that are studying kind of different cultural alliances from the sociological perspective. So a lot of the research that I was finding was actually very niche. It was about a specific group of poets, but not what impact does poetry have as a whole, and not even what impact does poetry have on this specific population or this specific population. It was just, this is an event I went to and let me talk about it. So it was kind of interesting to take all of these kind of small narratives and try to put them together to argue for poetry in the performance sphere having a major impact as a whole, and that being something that needs to be researched more. So instead of really ending up with a paper about a specific thing that performance poetry does, I was able to say, these are all the things that these things are hinting at, and academia really needs to do a better job at talking about it, and kind of a call for action more so than a definitive statement about performance poetry. I think it definitely will help me as I go into the field of education, because it was a lot of taking time to meet different people and diverse voices, and I also was able to learn a lot about youth poetry from the educational standpoint, which is something I wasn't expecting, and how poetry has been used in English classrooms to help particularly minority voices to feel like they are being accommodated to, because typically English classrooms focus on standard English and students feel like they need to code switch and aren't able to really express their own language and their own feelings and emotions, and how performance poetry can actually be a great tool in the classroom. So it's definitely something that I'm going to take with me as I hopefully go into being a secondary ed English teacher, and keep that in mind. I would definitely recommend doing something like this. It was a great way to kind of go into my senior year being able to research something I was actually interested in, and also have a lot of flexibility in my schedule, which gave me a chance to kind of still enjoy my last summer in college before I go out into the real world working, but feel like I'm also doing something that really matters, is really important, and giving me skills for grad school.